There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They don't announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. They slip in quietly, like a change in the light at dusk, and only in looking back do you realize that they were the hinges upon which your entire world turned. For me, that moment wasn't a grand declaration or a dramatic event. It was the sound of a door, a simple bedroom door, being left deliberately, thoughtfully, and silently ajar. It was an invitation offered in a language of empty space, a question asked by a sliver of hallway light falling across my floor. And I, lying awake in my own bed, had to decide if I was brave enough to understand what it was asking. To understand the weight of that open door, you have to understand the architecture of the world Julian and I had built over the preceding 8 years. It was a friendship constructed with the sturdy, reliable materials of mutual respect and shared history, a fortress of platonic safety. We met in a place that felt like my native habitat and his alien landscape, a university darkroom. I was a photography student, fluent in the language of silver halides and stop baths, moving through the hushed, ruby-lit space with a reverence that bordered on religious. He was a business major, a force of kinetic energy and booming laughter, taking the class to fulfill a mandatory arts credit he openly referred to as a colossal waste of a Tuesday afternoon. He was sunlight crashing into a cave, and I, a creature of shadow and quiet observation, was initially blinded by him. He was a disaster in that darkroom. He fogged his paper, he mixed up his chemicals, he once nearly tripped and sent a whole tray of developers sloshing onto a dozen developing prints. He was loud, clumsy, and utterly out of his element. Yet he possessed a charisma so potent that even our perpetually unimpressed professor couldn't help but smile at his self-deprecating apologies. I found myself watching him, not with annoyance, but with a kind of fascinated wonder. He moved through the world with an unshakable confidence that I, with my camera held like a shield between myself and everyone else, could only imagine. He saw life as a series of problems to be solved, doors to be kicked open. I saw it as a series of compositions to be framed, moments to be captured before they vanished. Our friendship began over a ruined print. His, of course. He'd been trying to capture a shot of the campus clock tower, and in his haste, he had exposed it for far too long. The image was a ghostly white silhouette against a field of muddy gray. He held it up with a groan of frustration, ready to crumple it. "Another masterpiece for the bin," he'd said, his voice echoing slightly in the small space. I heard the genuine disappointment beneath the joke. Without thinking, I found myself speaking. "You can save it," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He turned, and it felt like the first time he'd truly seen me, not as part of the darkroom's fixtures, but as a person. I showed him how to use a potassium ferricyanide solution to bleach the highlights, to gently paint the light back into the paper, rescuing the tower from the chemical fog. It was a delicate, painstaking process, and he washed my hands with an uncharacteristic stillness. When we were done, the print wasn't perfect, but it was there. The clock tower stood sharp against the sky. He looked from the print to me, and a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was a smile that rewired the very atmosphere of the room. "You're a magician, Leo," he'd said. And in that moment, some strange, invisible wall between us dissolved. From there, our lives became intertwined. He was the extrovert who dragged me, the quiet observer, out of my shell. He pulled me to parties where I would stand in a corner nursing a drink, perfectly content to people watch, while he commanded the center of the room, a vibrant sun pulling everyone into his orbit. I became his designated quiet space, the person he would find when the social energy finally waned. We'd sit on a porch step or a quiet curb, the party a dull thrum behind us, and he would talk. He talked about his classes, his anxieties about his future as a consultant, the intricate politics of his sports team, and, most often, the girls he was dating. I became the keeper of his stories, the steady, non-judgmental archive of his life. I listened, and I learned the cartography of his heart, its easy affections, its surprising vulnerabilities, its deep-seated desire to be seen as reliable and strong. And somewhere in those thousands of hours of shared silence and easy conversation, I fell in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, crashing wave. It was a slow, rising tide. It was in the way he'd absent-mindedly nudge his foot against mine under a table. It was in the low, rumbling sound of his laugh when he was genuinely amused. It was in the concentrated frown he got when he was trying to understand one of my esoteric explanations about f-stops and depth of field. It was in the bone-deep trust he placed in me, a trust so complete and unthinking that it felt both like a gift and a curse. I knew everything about him, except the one thing I desperately wanted to know. Could he ever see me as more? But he was Julian. He was a straight line, a clear path, a man who dated women with bright smiles and easy grace, women who fit into the sunlit world he occupied. And I was me, the quiet friend, the safe harbor, the darkroom where he could come and see what developed. So I buried it. I packed my feelings down into a dense, silent core within myself, building walls of casual friendship around it so thick I sometimes convinced myself it wasn't there. I learned to speak a language of careful neutrality, to offer advice about his girlfriends without letting the acid of jealousy burn my tongue. I photographed his life, always from the edge of the frame, capturing his joy, his triumphs, his heartbreaks, while remaining an invisible presence behind the lens. The friendship was too precious, too essential to my own architecture, to risk its foundations for a feeling that felt like a guaranteed demolition. The fear of his rejection was a cold, physical thing, but it was nothing compared to the terror of his absence. And so, for 8 years, I became a master of sublimation, an artist of the unspoken. I loved him quietly, patiently, and from what I believed was a permanent and uncrossable distance. The shift, when it came, started not with a whisper, but with a crack. Julian had always defined himself by his competence. He was the guy who could handle anything, the one who fixed problems, for his family, for his friends, for the high-powered consulting firm that worked him to the bone. His identity was welded to his success. Then came the project in Chicago. For 6 months, it consumed him. He was flying back and forth, living on stale airport coffee and 4 hours of sleep. He called me from hotel rooms, his voice frayed and thin, the usual buoyant energy replaced by a weary static. He was managing a massive software integration for a client, and it was, in his words, a total catastrophe. The client was impossible, his team was green, and the pressure from his bosses was immense. At the same time, his relationship with a woman named Claire, a relationship he'd been hopeful about, was fraying under the strain of his absence and stress. I was his late-night call, his pressure release valve. I'd sit in my quiet apartment, the city lights painting soft patterns on my wall, and just listen as he vented his frustrations. I could hear the foundations of his confidence beginning to groan under the weight of it all. He wasn't just tired, he was scared. He was scared of failing, of letting people down, of not being the capable, unflappable Julian everyone expected him to be. I offered what I could, reassurance, a listening ear, a reminder to eat something that wasn't from a vending machine. But I felt useless, watching from a distance as the storm gathered around him. The day it all broke, the call came at 2 in the morning. I answered on the first ring, my heart lurching with a premonition of disaster. His voice was hollow, a ghost of its usual timbre. They pulled the plug, he said. Just that. The project was canceled. His firm had lost the client, and the failure was being laid squarely at his feet. There was a long, ragged silence on the line. Then he added, his voice cracking, "And Claire, she's done. She said she needs someone who's actually present." It was a 1-2 punch that had shattered him. He had lost his professional footing and his personal anchor in the same devastating blow. "Where are you?" I asked, my own voice tight with concern. "O'Hare," he whispered. I'm on a flight home. Don't go to your apartment," I said, the words coming out before I'd even fully formed the thought. "It's empty. It'll be too quiet. Just come here." There was another pause, and in it, I could hear the shuddering breath of a man trying desperately to hold himself together. "Okay," he breathed. "Leo, okay." When he arrived at my door an hour later, he looked like a shipwreck. His suit was rumpled, His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a tremor in his hands he couldn't control. The usual light in him was gone, extinguished. He didn't seem to have the energy to even cross the threshold. I reached out, took his travel bag from his hand, and gently pulled him inside, closing the door behind him. He stood in the middle of my living room, looking lost and small in a way I had never seen him before. He wasn't the sun anymore. He was a collapsing star. He looked at me, his face a mask of exhaustion and shame, and his composure finally crumbled. A single, ragged sob escaped him, and he covered his face with his hands. In 8 years, I had never seen Julian cry. Not once. I didn't think. I didn't analyze. I just moved. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling his tall frame against me. For a moment, he was stiff with surprise, and then he just sagged, leaning his full weight against me, his shoulders shaking. I held him, my hand on the back of his head, just like I had seen him do for countless others, offering the simple, profound comfort of a steady presence in a storm. We stood there for a long time. The only sound in the room is quiet, broken breathing. The rules of our friendship, the carefully maintained distance, the unspoken boundaries, they had all just evaporated in the face of his profound need. He wasn't my straight best friend in that moment. He was just Julian, and he had fallen apart, and I was the only one there to catch the pieces. That night marked the beginning of the ritual. I settled him on my couch, a sprawling, comfortable thing that had witnessed years of our movie marathons and late-night talks. I didn't ask if he wanted to talk more. The exhaustion was rolling off him in visible waves. I just put on some mindless nature documentary, something with soothing narration about deep-sea life, and dimmed the lights. I made him a cup of tea, which he held in both hands as if for warmth, his gaze fixed on the screen, but seeing nothing. After a few minutes, his head began to nod, the mug tilting precariously. I gently took it from him and set it on the coffee table. He mumbled an apology, trying to sit up straighter. "Just rest, Julian," I said softly. "Don't try to do anything. Just be." He looked at me, his eyes glassy with unshed tears and fatigue. He nodded, a small, defeated gesture. He slumped back against the cushions, and within minutes, he was asleep. It was a sleep born of pure emotional and physical depletion, deep and immediate. I watched him for a long time, the flicker of the television casting shifting blue and green light across his face. He looked younger, the lines of stress around his eyes and mouth softened in repose. The formidable armor of his confidence was gone, leaving behind only the vulnerable man I had always known was underneath. My heart ached with a feeling so intense it was almost painful, a fierce, protective love that felt ancient and elemental. I carefully draped a thick woolen blanket over him, tucking it around his shoulders. My fingers brushed against the side of his neck, and his skin was warm. The contact sent a jolt through me, a forbidden spark in the quiet darkness. I pulled my hand back as if burned, my breath catching in my chest. I retreated to my bedroom, leaving my own door open, listening to the sound of his steady breathing from the other room until I finally fell into a fitful sleep. He stayed on the couch for 3 nights. He'd wake up disoriented, wrapped in the blanket, and give me a sheepish, grateful look. He barely spoke about what had happened. It was too raw. Instead, we fell into a quiet domesticity. I'd make coffee in the morning, and we'd drink it in silence. I'd work on editing photos at my desk while he sat on the couch with his laptop, half-heartedly answering emails from his boss, trying to piece together the professional wreckage. In the evenings, we'd order food, watch movies, and he would inevitably drift off to sleep on the couch again. Each night, I would cover him with the blanket. Each night, the brief, accidental touch of my hand against his arm or his hair felt like a seismic event in my carefully controlled inner world. I was living in a state of suspended reality, a strange and tender dream I was terrified of waking from. I had him here, in my space, in a way I never had before. But it was a closeness born of his brokenness, and a small, shameful part of me was terrified of him getting better, of him not needing me anymore, of him returning to his own apartment and rebuilding the walls between us. The 4th night, a new storm rolled in, this one outside. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled with a mournful sound that seemed to mirror the mood inside the apartment. We were watching some old black and white film, the volume turned up to compete with the weather. Julian was restless. He kept shifting on the couch, unable to get comfortable, his gaze distant. The silence between us felt different tonight, not peaceful, but charged with his unexpressed anxiety. Finally, he muted the television and turned to me. "I can't sleep," he said, his voice quiet. "Every time I close my eyes, I just see that conference room." The look on their faces, he ran a hand through his already messy hair. "My couch is so much less comfortable than yours." He was trying for a joke, but it fell flat, landing in the tense air between us with a dull thud. I knew it wasn't about the couch. It was about the loneliness. It was about the silence that would be waiting for him in his own apartment, a silence that would amplify his feelings of failure. My living room, with me in it, was the only thing holding that silence at bay. "You can stay as long as you need. You know that," I said, my voice steady despite the frantic fluttering in my chest. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face for something. "Leo," he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "This is going to sound weird. And if it's weird, just say so. But I don't want to be alone right now. Not even just in the same room." He trailed off, looking down at his hands. The vulnerability was excruciating and beautiful. My entire body felt like a live wire. I knew what he was asking, even if he couldn't say the words. He was asking me to break another rule. He was asking for a level of comfort that our friendship had never, ever allowed for. My mind screamed 1,000 warnings. This is dangerous. This is a line. Once you cross it, you can never go back. He's vulnerable. He doesn't mean it the way you want him to. But then I looked at his face, at the raw need etched into his features, and my heart overruled my head. The heart, which had loved him silently for 8 years, was not going to deny him comfort now. "It's not weird," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Come here." The relief that washed over his face was so profound it almost brought me to my knees. He moved slowly, hesitantly, as if unsure of the protocol. He lay down on the couch, his back to the cushions, and I shifted so that I was lying beside him, propped up on an elbow. The space between us hummed with a palpable energy. He hesitated for another moment, and then he let out a long, shuddering breath and rested his head on my chest. Time stopped. My world compressed to the feeling of his hair against my chin, the solid, warm weight of him against my side, the soft puff of his breath against the fabric of my shirt. My arm, trapped awkwardly behind him, began to go numb, but I didn't dare move. I wrapped my other arm around his shoulders, holding him. His own arm came up to rest loosely around my waist. It was an embrace, but it was chaste, desperate, a human seeking anchorage in a storm. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against which his own, I could feel, was slowly, gradually, beginning to calm. He smelled of rain and soap, and something that was uniquely, achingly Julian. I rested my cheek against the top of his head and stared at the ceiling, trying to breathe, trying to commit every single sensation to memory. This was heaven, and this was torture. It was everything I had ever wanted, offered under a pretext that meant it could never truly be mine. He wasn't choosing me. He was choosing the absence of being alone. And for now, I had to be okay with that. He fell asleep like that, his breathing evening out into a deep, peaceful rhythm. And I stayed awake for hours, holding him, terrified and grateful, a living paradox of joy and sorrow. The ritual had now fundamentally changed. The couch became our shared space. It was no longer about him falling asleep by accident. It became an unspoken assumption. After a movie, or after talking, he would simply shift, find his place against my chest, and I would hold him. We never spoke of it. In the morning, it was as if a reset button had been pushed. We'd untangle ourselves with a shared, sleepy awkwardness and go about the morning routine, the immense intimacy of the night before packed away into a silent, unacknowledged box. It was a fragile, bizarre equilibrium. By day, we were best friends navigating a crisis. By night, we were something else entirely, something for which there was no name. I was living a dual existence, and the strain of it was beginning to wear on me. I felt like a photographer in a darkroom, watching an image of us slowly develop in the chemical bath, terrified that if I let in any light, if I asked a single question, the whole beautiful, impossible picture would be exposed and ruined. After a week, the physical reality of the couch began to assert itself. It was long, but not that long. We were two grown men, and the space was cramped. We'd wake up with stiff necks and aching backs. One morning, after a particularly restless night, Julian sat up, rubbing the back of his neck with a wince. "I think I'm getting too old to sleep on a couch," he said, attempting a light-hearted tone. "Even your ridiculously comfortable one." My heart sank. I thought this was it, the end of the ritual. He was feeling better, the practical discomfort was outweighing the emotional need, and he would go back to his own apartment. I braced myself for the words, trying to arrange my face into a mask of casual understanding. But that's not what he said. He looked over at me, his expression hesitant, a little embarrassed. "This is probably another one of those weird questions," he started, a preface that was becoming his tell for when he was about to step over another boundary. "But your bed is big enough for two, right? I mean, I could just take the other side. It would just be for sleeping. It's just, I don't think I'm ready for my own place yet." The silence is still too loud. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. This was an escalation I hadn't even allowed myself to imagine. My bed. My bed was my sanctuary, the most private space in my already private world. The thought of him there, next to me, breathing the same air in the dark, was both terrifying and so intensely desirable that it made my head spin. All my internal alarms were screaming. This was too much, too close, a line so definitive that pretending it was platonic would require a level of self-delusion I wasn't sure I possessed. But the fear in his eyes was real. He wasn't trying to manipulate me. He was genuinely asking for help, for sanctuary. He was a man adrift, and I was his only port. To say no would feel like a betrayal, like pushing him back out into the storm when he was so close to shore. I swallowed, forcing my voice to remain even. "My bed is huge," I said, the words feeling inadequate and small. "And my guest room is currently full of camera equipment. So yeah, of course. The other side is yours." The gratitude on his face was blinding. "Thank you, Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I swear, I don't know what I'd do without you." And I thought, you have no idea. That night, I felt a nervous energy I hadn't experienced since I was a teenager. I changed the sheets on my bed, using the good linen ones I saved for. Well, I'd never actually had an occasion to use them before. I showered, brushed my teeth twice. I was acting like it was a date, and I had to keep reminding myself, viciously, that it was not. It was a sleepover. It was a crisis intervention. It was two friends sharing a space for practical reasons. But my body, my heart, they weren't listening to my brain's frantic rationalizations. We went to bed at different times, a small, unspoken courtesy to give each other the illusion of privacy. I got in first, lying rigidly on my side, my back to the empty space where he would be. I heard the bathroom door close, the sound of the shower, the sink running. Every mundane sound was amplified, charged with significance. I held my breath when I heard my bedroom door creak open. He moved quietly in the dark, and then I felt the mattress dip as he got in on the other side. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. He lay on his back, I on my side, a chasm of a few feet between us that felt both as wide as an ocean and as thin as a sheet of paper. I was acutely aware of everything. The sound of his breathing, deeper and slower than mine. The warmth radiating from his body across the cool sheets. The subtle scent of my own soap on his skin. It was an intimacy so profound it was almost unbearable. I lay there, motionless, for what felt like hours, my muscles coiled tight. I was terrified that if I moved, if I even breathed too loudly, I would break the spell. Then, from across the chasm, his voice came, a soft murmur in the darkness. "Leo." "Yeah." I answered, my own voice husky. "Thanks again," he said. "For all of this, it's nothing," I lied. "It was everything." There was another long pause. I felt him shift, turning onto his side, facing my back. I could feel the change in the air behind me, the increase in warmth. My entire back tingled with awareness. I waited, my heart pounding a frantic, silent rhythm against the mattress. I waited for a touch, a hand on my shoulder, something to acknowledge the insane tension that filled the space between us. But it never came. After a few minutes, his breathing deepened, evening out into the familiar cadence of sleep. He had found his peace, and I was left wide awake in the dark, vibrating with an impossible longing, closer to him than ever before and feeling more alone than I ever had. This became the new ritual, the new normal. Julian essentially moved into my apartment. He brought over a bag of clothes. His toothbrush took up residence in the cup next to mine. He still had his own place, but he only went there to pick up mail or a fresh change of clothes. He started to heal. The hollowed-out look in his eyes began to recede, replaced by flashes of the old Julian. He started talking about finding a new job, about the future. He laughed more. And every night, he would slip into the other side of my bed. The chasm between us remained. We were two separate islands in the same sea, close enough to feel the tide of the other's presence, but never touching. The nightly cuddling on the couch was a thing of the past, a brief, feverish dream of intimacy that had been replaced by this new, more sustainable, and infinitely more agonizing form of closeness. After a couple of weeks, I cleared out my guest room. It was a small room I used for storing lighting rigs, tripods, and boxes of old negatives. It took me a full day, but I disassembled the shelves, packed the equipment into a corner, and set up the simple futon frame that had been folded against the wall. I put fresh sheets on it, a pillow, a lamp on a small crate beside it. It was sparse, but it was a room. It was a space that was his. That evening, when he came home from a coffee meeting, his first tentative step back into the professional world, I showed it to him. "I figured you might want your own space," I said, trying to sound casual, like it was a practical solution I'd just thought of. "The bed thing is probably not a great long-term solution for your back." I was offering him an out. I was offering us both an out. A way to return to a more manageable, less emotionally fraught configuration. A way for me to get some sleep, to stop lying awake every night, achingly aware of him beside me. It felt like the right thing to do, the sensible thing. It also felt like I was sawing off my own arm. He stood in the doorway of the guest room, looking at the neatly made futon. He was quiet for a long time. I couldn't read his expression. I thought I saw a flicker of disappointment, but I immediately dismissed it as wishful thinking. Of course he would be relieved. He was getting his own space back. "Wow, Leo," he said finally, his voice soft. "You didn't have to do all this. It's fine," I said, shrugging. "It was time I cleaned it out anyway." "No, it's really thoughtful," he said, still not looking at me, his gaze fixed on the room. "Thank you." That night, the house felt cavernous. He went to his new room, and I went to mine. He closed the door. I lay in my bed, in the center of it now, and the space felt vast and cold. The silence from the other room was absolute. It was what I had wanted, wasn't it? A return to normalcy. But it felt like a punishment. I missed the sound of his breathing. I missed the warmth. I had offered him an exit, and he had taken it without a moment's hesitation. The pain of it was a dull, heavy ache in my chest. I had finally gotten what I thought I needed, and it was unbearable. But the next night, something changed. When Julian went to the guest room, he left the door open. Not wide open, but ajar. Just a crack. A sliver of light from the hallway cut across the floor, and I could hear the small sounds of him settling in, the rustle of sheets, a soft cough. It wasn't a closed-off silence anymore. It was a presence. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it an accident? A careless oversight? Or was it something else? A signal? My mind, always so prone to overanalysis, went into overdrive. An open door was an invitation. It was a sign of trust. It was a way of saying, "I'm here if you need me." It was also just an open door. I was projecting, creating meaning where there was none. I was a madman building a cathedral out of a stray feather. The third night, he did it again. And the fourth. The open door became the new ritual, and I began to understand its silent language. The closed door on that first night had been him accepting the space I'd offered, respecting the boundary I had drawn. But the open door was him gently, quietly, erasing that boundary again. It was his way of saying, I'm in my room, and you're in yours, but we are not separate. It was a compromise, a way for us to maintain a semblance of normalcy while acknowledging the deep, unspoken current of connection that now ran between us. And so began the strangest, most beautiful, and most torturous period of my life. I would lie awake in my bed and watch the sliver of light from his open door. I would listen for his breathing. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear him shift or sigh in his sleep, and my heart would clench. We were living together, but apart. We were intimate, but chaste. We were suspended in a perfect, fragile bubble of ambiguity. And every day I woke up terrified that it was the day the bubble would pop. He was getting stronger, more confident. He was interviewing for jobs. He was reconnecting with friends. The crisis was passing. And soon, he would no longer need his sanctuary. He would no longer need me. The open door was a comfort, but it was also a countdown. And I had no idea what would happen when the timer ran out. The crossing happened on a Thursday. It was late autumn, and the air had turned crisp and cold. Julian had a final round interview that day for a promising new job. He'd left the apartment in the morning looking more like his old self than I'd seen him in months. Sharp suit, confident stride, a spark of determination in his eyes. I spent the day a wreck, a knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach on his behalf. I tried to edit photos, but I couldn't focus. I kept checking my phone, waiting for a text. He came back just after 7. I heard his key in the lock, and I met him in the hallway. He was standing there, his shoulders slumped, his briefcase hanging limply from his hand. He looked defeated. I didn't get it, he said, his voice flat. My heart plummeted. Oh, Julian. I'm so sorry, he shrugged, a gesture that was meant to be nonchalant but was laden with disappointment. It's fine. The market's tough. On to the next 1 inch, he walked past me towards his room, the fragile armor of his pride firmly back in place. He was shutting me out. He closed his door. Not ajar. Click. Closed. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet apartment. It was a definitive statement. I need to be alone. For the first time since he had come to stay with me, the line was drawn, the boundary re-erected. And it hurt more than I could have imagined. I made dinner, but I didn't have an appetite. I sat on the couch, the television off, and just listened to the silence from his room. Hours passed. I felt the chasm between us widening, the comfortable intimacy we had built over the past weeks dissolving into a formal, painful distance. I was losing him. He was healing, and in his healing, he was remembering how to be self-sufficient, how to keep his pain to himself. He was rebuilding his own walls, and I was on the outside of them. Around midnight, I gave up and went to my own room. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling a loneliness so profound it was like a physical weight on my chest. The closed door was a final, brutal confirmation of what I had feared all along. I was a port in a storm, and the storm had passed. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, a soft sound pulled me from the edge of sleep. A creak. I opened my eyes. The sliver of light was back. His door was open again. I lay perfectly still, my heart starting to pound. I heard the soft padding of bare feet on the hardwood floor of the hallway. He was coming towards my room. He appeared in my doorway, a tall silhouette against the dim light from the hall. He just stood there for a moment, not speaking. Can't sleep? I asked, my voice a rough whisper. He shook his head. He walked slowly into the room and sat on the edge of my bed, his back to me. He was so close I could have reached out and touched him. I lied, he said, his voice low and strained. About the job. I sat up, my confusion overriding my anxiety. What do you mean? He turned to look at me, and in the dim light, I could see that his eyes were glistening. They offered it to me, he said. This afternoon. It's a great offer. Good company, good money, better hours. I was stunned into silence. This was good news. This was fantastic news. So why did he look like his world was ending all over again? Julian, that's amazing, I finally managed to say. Why would you lie? He looked down at his hands, which were clenched together in his lap. Because if I got the job, that means everything goes back to normal. It means I have no more excuses. No reason to be here. He looked up at me, his expression raw and terrified. And I don't want to go, Leo. The thought of going back to my apartment, to sleeping in my own bed, alone, it feels impossible. It feels wrong, my breath caught in my throat. The air in the room became thick, heavy with everything that had been left unsaid for weeks, for years. This was it, the moment of truth. The bubble was stretching, thinning, about to pop. This isn't just about not wanting to be alone, is it? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. It was a risk, a huge one. I was forcing the issue, tearing down the comfortable pretense we had been living under. He shook his head slowly, his gaze locked on mine. No, he whispered. I don't think it ever was. He moved closer, shifting from the edge of the bed to kneel beside me. The space between us was gone. I could feel the heat of his body, smell the faint, familiar scent of his skin. He lifted a hand, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently touching my cheek. His touch was electric, a current that shot through every nerve in my body. My carefully constructed walls, the fortress I had built around my heart for 8 years, crumbled into dust. Leo, he breathed, his voice full of a wonder and fear and a dawning, terrifying realization. What is this? What have we been doing? I don't know. I whispered back, my own voice breaking. I've just been trying not to break it. A sad, beautiful smile touched his lips. Me too. He searched my eyes, and whatever he saw there must have been enough. Would it be okay? He asked, his voice cracking on the last word. It was the gentlest, most vulnerable question I had ever heard. He wasn't asking for permission to kiss me. He was asking if it was safe. He was asking if I would be there to catch him when he took this final, terrifying leap. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. I just leaned forward, closing the last impossible inch between us, and met his lips with my own. The kiss was not what I had imagined in my years of silent longing. It wasn't passionate or demanding. It was quiet. It was tentative. It was a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of salt and relief. It was the feeling of a long-lost traveler finally coming home. It was a confession whispered in the dark, a truth that had been hiding in plain sight, in every shared glance, in every lingering touch, in every night spent breathing the same air. We were not two separate islands anymore. We were the same landmass, finally admitting that the water in between had only ever been an illusion. I brought my hand up to cup the back of his neck, and he let out a soft, shuddering sigh, melting into me. The kiss deepened, becoming more sure, more certain. It was a confirmation, a beginning. In the quiet of my bedroom, with the hallway lights spilling in through the open door, the world I had known ended, and a new one, brighter and more terrifying and more beautiful than I could have ever dreamed, began. The morning after was quiet, a different kind of quiet than we had ever shared before. It was a fragile, shimmering thing, filled with the ghost of the night's confession. We woke up tangled together, my arms slung over his waist, his head resting on my shoulder. For a few blissful, hazy moments, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Then, awareness dawned, and with it came a palpable tension. Julian gently extricated himself from my arms, his movements careful, almost apologetic. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I should shower, he mumbled, and disappeared into the bathroom. I lay in bed, the warmth of his body still imprinted on the sheets, my heart a confused, fluttering bird in my chest. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated joy, quickly followed by a cold wave of dread. Last night had been a breakthrough, a miracle. But what did it mean in the harsh light of day? It had been born of an emotional confession, a moment of profound vulnerability. But Julian was a man who, his entire life, had identified as straight. He had built his world on that foundation. A single, earth-shattering kiss couldn't just demolish that overnight. When he came out of the bathroom, dressed, he still wouldn't look at me directly. He busied himself gathering his things from his room, his movements jerky and unnatural. The easy, comfortable domesticity we had built was gone, replaced by a stilted, agonizing awkwardness. I have to go, he said, standing by the front door, his briefcase in hand. I have to go to my place. Sort some things out. Sign the papers for the new job. They were all legitimate reasons, but they felt like excuses. He was running. The beautiful, honest space we had created last night had become a cage, and he was desperate to escape it. Julian, I said, my voice quiet. I stood up and walked towards him. Are we going to talk about this? He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a panicked confusion that broke my heart. I don't know what to say, Leo, he said, his voice strained. I can't. I need to think. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence he left in his wake was absolute. It was 100 times worse than the silence before he had come to stay. It was a silence filled with the memory of a kiss, with the weight of a monumental, terrifying new reality. I stood there in my living room, the scene of our first tentative steps toward this new intimacy, and felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow me whole. I had finally gotten everything I'd ever wanted, and I had no idea if I had just destroyed the most important relationship of my life in the process. The next 3 days were a special kind of hell. My texts to him went unanswered. My calls went straight to voicemail. The silence from his end was a deafening roar in my life. I cycled through every possible emotion. I replayed the kiss, the conversation, 1,000 times, analyzing every word, every gesture, searching for a clue I had missed. Had I pushed him too hard? Had I misinterpreted his desperation as something more? The shame and self-doubt were corrosive. I imagined him in his own apartment, trying to scrub the memory of our kiss from his mind, trying to realign himself with the person he had always believed himself to be. I imagined him feeling disgusted, or ashamed, or worse, pitying. My carefully guarded heart, which I had finally, recklessly, opened, was now exposed and bleeding. The pain was physical. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep in my bed. The ghost of him was too present. I spent my nights on the couch, wrapped in the same blanket I had once used to cover him, feeling like a fool. I had mistaken a moment of crisis for a change of heart. I had been a comfort, a convenience, and when the real world came calling back, with its jobs and its expectations and its rigid definitions, I was no longer needed. The friendship, my 8-year bedrock, felt like it had been pulverized. By the 4th day, the pain had curdled into a quiet, simmering anger. An anger at him for his cowardice, but mostly an anger at myself for letting this happen. I couldn't live like this anymore, suspended in his silence, waiting for a verdict he was too afraid to deliver. I deserved more than that. Our friendship, even if it was all we had left, deserved more than to be killed by a ghost. I grabbed my keys, my heart pounding with a grim resolve. If he wouldn't come to me, I would go to him. I was going to get an answer, one way or another. I couldn't live in the space between his sentences anymore. I drove to his apartment, a place I had been to hundreds of times, but it felt like I was approaching a foreign country. I stood outside his door for a full minute, my hand hovering over the buzzer, my resolve wavering. What if he wasn't there? What if he was, and he didn't answer? What if he did, and he looked at me with coldness or regret? I took a deep breath and pressed the button. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, the intercom crackled to life. Yeah. His voice was hesitant, wary. It's me, I said, my own voice surprisingly steady. We need to talk, Julian. There was a long pause. I could picture him on the other side, his hand on the button, warring with himself. Finally, the lock buzzed, a harsh, electric sound that made me jump. I pushed the door open and walked up the 3 flights of stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. He was waiting in his open doorway. He looked terrible. He was wearing the same sweatpants he'd had on 3 days ago. His hair was a mess, and his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. His apartment, usually so neat and ordered, was in a state of disarray. Takeout containers littered the counter, and clothes were draped over a chair. He hadn't been sorting things out. He had been hiding. He stepped back to let me in, not meeting my eyes. He closed the door, and we stood in the awkward silence of his entryway. So, he said, his voice rough. You're here. You didn't give me much of a choice, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. 3 days, Julian. Not a word. What am I supposed to think? He finally looked at me, and his face was a portrait of anguish. I know, he whispered. Leo, I'm so sorry. I've been a coward. He gestured vaguely at the mess around us. I came back here, and I just fell apart again. But this time you weren't here. The anger in me deflated, replaced by a familiar, weary ache. Why did you run? I asked, my voice softer now. Why didn't you just talk to me? He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. Because I don't know who I am anymore, he said, his voice cracking. My whole life, there's been a roadmap. Go to school, get the good job, meet a nice girl, get married. It was all laid out. I knew the rules. And then, all of this happened. And you were the only thing that made sense. Being with you, in your apartment, it was the only time I felt safe. The only time I felt, okay. He took a shaky breath. That night, when I kissed you, it wasn't a mistake. It felt like I'd been walking in the wrong direction my whole life, and had finally turned around. It felt like coming home. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to understand. But then the sun came up, and the roadmap was still there. And all the voices, my parents, my friends, society, my own voice, they were all screaming at me that I had taken a wrong turn, that I was on a road that doesn't exist on my map. And I panicked. He collapsed onto his couch, burying his head in his hands. I'm so scared, Leo, he mumbled into his palms. I'm scared of what this means. I'm scared of what people will think. But most of all, he looked up, his eyes shining with tears. I'm scared of losing you. And I feel like no matter what I do, that's what's going to happen. If I ignore this, I lose the only thing that's felt real in months. If I don't know what I'm doing, and I'm going to mess it up and hurt you, and I'll lose you anyway. His confession, so raw and messy and honest, washed away the last of my anger. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified. He was grieving a version of himself, a future he had always taken for granted, and he didn't know how to build a new one. I walked over and sat down next to him on the couch. I didn't touch him. I just sat there, a quiet presence, just as I had been from the very beginning. You're right, I said, after a long moment of silence. You don't have a map for this. Neither do I. I finally turned to look at him. But here's what I know. For 8 years, you have been the most important person in my life. And for a lot of those years, I have been quietly, hopelessly in love with you. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. He had known, on some level, but hearing the words, spoken plainly and without adornment, was something else entirely. Watching you fall apart was agonizing. I continued, my voice steady. And holding you together has been the most terrifying and beautiful thing I have ever done. What happened between us wasn't a mistake. It was gravity. It was two people who have been orbiting each other for years finally getting close enough to feel the pull. I'm scared too, Julian. But I'm not scared of this. The only thing I'm scared of is going back to the way things were before. I finally reached out and placed my hand over his. His fingers were cold. We don't need a map, I said softly. We just need to be willing to take the next step. Together. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to stop running. Tears streamed down his face, silent and uninhibited. He didn't try to wipe them away. He just looked at me, a storm of fear and hope and dawning love in his eyes. He squeezed my hand, a grip that was both desperate and sure. Okay, he whispered, the word of promise. Okay, no more running. We didn't go back to my place that day. We stayed at his, and we began the slow, quiet work of building something new. We ordered pizza and sat on the floor and talked for hours. We talked about his fears, about my years of silence, about what this new, undefined thing between us might look like. There were no more grand declarations, no more earth-shattering kisses. It was quieter than that. It was a realignment, a slow turning towards each other. That night, for the first time, I slept in his bed. He held me, his arms wrapped securely around me, his head tucked into the crook of my neck. It wasn't a gesture of desperation or need anymore. It was a choice. It was a statement. It was the beginning of our new language. The next morning, we woke up to the sun streaming through his window. The awkwardness was gone, replaced by a soft, peaceful certainty. As I was making coffee in his kitchen, watching him move around his own space with a new, lighter energy, he came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. "I have to go to the new office today," he said quietly into my ear. "Sign the final papers, okay?" I said, leaning back into his embrace. "But after," he said, his voice firm, "I'm coming back to your place. And then I think I need to call a realtor. This place is too big for one person. And it's much too far from you." I turned in his arms to face him, my heart swelling with a quiet, profound joy. He smiled, a real, genuine Julian smile, the first one I'd seen that reached all the way to his eyes in months. It was like watching the sun rise after a long, dark night. He leaned in and kissed me, a soft, simple kiss that tasted of coffee and the promise of 1,000 more mornings just like this one. It was never about the open door, I realized. It wasn't about a threshold to be crossed. It was about demolishing the walls we had built inside ourselves. It was about finding the courage to admit that the safest place in the world wasn't a room or a house, but a space you build with another person. It was about the beautiful, honest, and terrifying work of healing, not alone in the dark, but together in the light. And we were just beginning.